Now, if you're a fan of George Shearing, you will be very aware of his incredible block chord playing. But as a guitar player, is it something we can imitate, or is it something just reserved for pianists? So in this lesson, I'm going to break down what types of chords George was using and how we can try and make that work for the guitar. Oh, and by the way, if you've not listened much to George Shearing, I thoroughly recommend this album, the MPS Trio Sessions with Louis Stewart on guitar. Now, there's no better place to find out what George was doing than from the man himself. So in his own words, in his autobiography, he said this about his famous playing style. It came about by combining two distinct musical elements: the voicings of the Glenn Miller saxophone section and the so-called locked hands piano style of a man named Milt Buckner, whom I had first heard playing with Lionel Hampton's big band. I'll play the chords that lie entirely within the compass of a single octave. For example, if you take a simple chord in the key of C, the left hand plays the C below middle C, the right hand plays E just above it, the G above that, the A above that, and the C above that. So relating that to guitar, that is 5 notes, and the top note and the bottom note are the same, so an octave apart. And then you've got to cram the other 3 notes in between that. And if you know anything about the fretboard and the way the guitar works and the way chords work on the guitar, that's going to be challenging. And it would happen to create some physically impossible chord shapes, which there's no point injuring ourselves trying to do. So I think the closest we can get to this is 4-note chords off the A or the D string, meaning we would have to sacrifice one of those notes George was playing. Typically, if we do that, it's the 5th giving us these kind of voicings. So George described a C6 and he was playing 1, 3, 5, 6, 1. So we could do that. We could have the C on the top and on the bottom, and then we could have the 6th and the 3rd in the middle with a C6 like this. Quite a nice sounding chord, quite plain. Maybe if I tried to do a minor 7, like D minor 7, say I'm trying to harmonise the C major scale here, we could do this. It's quite a pleasant sound. So that's root, 3rd, 7, octave of the root, E minor 7. We'd have the same again, obviously, giving us so far a certain sweetness to these voicings. F6, same as the first voicing. You know, having doubling notes in chords is quite unusual for jazz guitar, especially the root, but it does give it a sense of strength. And then G7, now this would be a classic guitar voicing, look. The C7 kind of shape, you know, so giving us and then A minor 7, same as those voicings we had for D minor 7 and E minor 7, giving us 1 and then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, chord 7, B minor 7 flat 5. Because it hasn't got a 5 in it, it'd be just like a B minor 7 really. Then I get back to home to C6, all the way up here, giving us our 7 chords in the key of C. Now, I think this is quite an interesting sound. Whether it quite matches what George does, I still think they're really nice, viable voicings that you could use either in comping or to harmonise a chord melody. Or you could do nice things like, I don't know, we'd take that C6 here. If I went from C major 7 to C6, so you get that 4 from 3rd to root. Like, do it with F. Could be done, you know, that's just some sort of ideas in terms of how you use it. But what we have there is just chords with the root on the top, right? So I think if you got into the inversions of these, things would get a bit complicated. But anyway, if we tried to do it off the D string, I think that would sound quite nice too. So the same voicing, so if we had root 3, 6 root, we're going to find the same thing, but it would be an octave higher. And then the D minor would be in the E minor. I'll drop lower here just for those of you that don't have a cutaway. G7, A minor 7, B minor 7 flat 5 without the flat 5, back to C6. I actually think that sounds really nice. And this is where you start to just it's a Pandora's box, chord voicings on the guitar, if you like. And there's some things I've never thought of doing, and I'll tell you why. You just get stuck using the same voicing sometimes, don't you? And also you don't think of maybe, oh, why don't I try this, why don't I do that? And it's only when I think you take inspiration from recordings, which is so important to me, that you suddenly go, oh, if I'm trying to imitate that player, how would I do it? And when you try and imitate a pianist like George Shearing, Oscar Peterson, all those greats, Bill Evans, you're going to run into issues with trying to replicate their chords because we can't play as many notes at the same time. So you have to sacrifice notes. So in all of these chords, we've sacrificed the fifth. We've got the root on top. But it is quite a pleasant, quite a serene sound. I would say in that Shearing sound, it's more common to use sixths than maybe sevenths. So hence why we're using C6 and F6. If I'd have used C major 7, that would have made for some interesting voicings. Or it's going to be horrible to do. And it just doesn't sound particularly nice because what we've ended up with is a minor second interval on the top by the closeness of the seventh and the root. So they sound okay, but they don't have the richness of George's chords, and we haven't even considered inversions where things would get a bit off then in terms of playability. With you'd have to change which note you sacrifice in each inversion. That just is going to get very complicated quite quickly. And personally, I feel the doubling of the root a little dull on the guitar because it loses what's special about George's chords, and that is the closeness and how compact all those notes packed into one octave. That's what makes the sound, and that's where you get the interesting rubs between the harmony within a chord. And that tight sound is really lost when we've only got essentially 3 notes there because we're doubling the octave. So what is the way around this on the guitar without getting into very uncomfortable chord shapes? Well, for me, the best way to get to this sound is through drop 2 voicings. Now, drop 2 voicings are when you have a chord voicing where the notes are distributed on 4 adjacent strings. So for a chord like C6, that could be, off the E string, like that, but I don't tend to play drop 2 chords off the E string because they're quite muddy, but still a possible choice. You might have this. This is a really nice voicing. You have to get used to that because it's quite a difficult stretch, but it's a lovely sounding chord. And then we've got that nice rub of the notes. There's a nice sound there. Or you could do that off the D string, which I think this really sings. Compare that to my one I tried to do earlier, or there's definitely another layer of richness to offer with these drop 2. So personally, when I want to try and capture that sound, I harmonise a melody or comp with drop 2 chords. And when you want to try and do that, so harmonise a melody, a basic approach, well, I have to say it didn't seem basic to me at first, is to harmonise chord tones with chords and then non-chord tones with diminished chords. There's obviously more to George's playing than this. I don't want to reduce it down to that, but it's definitely a big part of his sound. For example, if I play the opening, say, 8 bars of Fly Me to the Moon, here I will harmonise chord tones with the chord in question at that moment in time. Everything else, non-chord tones, will get a diminished chord underneath it. And this is all in drop 2, that what I think of as the best way to get the Shearing sound on the guitar. But just looking at the opening of the melody, which goes... just the first bar, that's going C, B, A, G over the A minor, which is flat 3, non-chord tone, root 7. So I would find a drop 2 A minor 7 with the third on the top, a diminished with a B on the top, A minor 7 with the root on the top in drop 2, and then I need a drop 2 with the 7th on the top. So it goes, and I might, or, and now I'm going through the rest of it, and you'll see, on the melody, if I play through it, missed that G sharp there. There I coloured the notes which were non-chord tones as red. So when those chords come up, I'm going to have to harmonise them with a diminished with that note on top. So if the note on top was a D, and I need a diminished chord, then I need to build a diminished chord underneath that. Obviously, I need to be aware of what the interval is in relation to the chord, like knowing that the first note of the melody is a flat 3, and then being able to find my drop 2 chord with the flat 3 on the top. But if I tried, excuse me, to play through that first section in kind of that drop 2 sound with diminished for the known chord tones, it'd be something like this. And then our next chord, G7. Then F major 7. I actually ended up on my C6 I used earlier. Obviously, I've not played it like this. Oh, sorry, I missed one. I have made a chord melody arrangement of that song on my channel, but not played it since I recorded it. So it's kind of like I'm having to think it through there. You can see I'm trying to think, oh, that's a chord tone, that's not. I think there was one where it could have been a chord, and I actually played diminished instead because I felt it sounded better. But you can hear there, we're kind of alternating, not necessarily exclusively one then one, but it's that thing basically of when it's a chord tone, use an inversion of the chord in drop 2, and when it's not, use a diminished. You might think different, but I think those drop 2 chords get that shearing sound, well, as close as we can on the guitar. It offers us that tightness in the harmony. Now, other ways you can make these things sound a bit more like George, other than the types of voicing he used, that he'd also do things like slide into chords. If I was going to play that first chord, I might slide into it. You know, like that. Maybe slide into the first one of each bar. It could be much more, maybe more interesting rhythmically as well, of course. Another thing I think would imitate the sound a bit is to try and keep time with either mute or open strings between the chords, like again in Big It, you wouldn't want to keep doing that, but I think that works quite well as kind of just getting that nice rhythmic feel that he had. And one thing just listening there I can hear really is how those diminished chords, they create a beautiful sense of movement between those inversions of the chord in question, and obviously those drop 2 giving us that nice close harmony we associate with George. Now, one thing I can remember when I watch players like confidently with ease go through all these inversions, how do you get to the point where you can learn all of those inversions? Well, the thing that changed it for me was learning the harmonized 6th diminished scale, and this is a very big part of the Barry Harris method, where you take a major scale and you add an additional note between the 5th and the 6th, giving us an 8-note scale, so an octatonic scale: C, D, E, F, G, A flat, A, B, back to our root. Now, the really mind-blowing thing is that giving us C, D, E, F, G, A flat, A, B, back to C. And obviously the whole Barry Harris thing is another world. I remember spending a lot of lockdown on his Saturday Zoom sessions and just learning so much from his amazing approach to music. But I think one of the mind-blowing things about that is by adding that one note, the 4-note chords we can build actually, instead of getting 7 chords, you essentially get 2 chords and then subsequent inversions of those chords. It's very odd. By adding something, you reduce the amount of chords you can really build from the scale. And I think if you're anything like me, you need to maybe see this written down to understand it before I play it. But if we were to harmonise this 8-note scale, we'd get the following from each degree of the scale. From the note C, we get C, E, G, A, which is C6. From the second degree of the scale, we get D, F, A flat, B. That's a diminished chord. It's D diminished. From the third note of the scale, we get E, G, A, C. That's just an inversion of the first, what we got off the first note. So that is C6 in first inversion, so C6/E. Off the 4th degree of the scale, we get F, A flat, B, D, giving us F diminished, or an inversion of D diminished if you like. Off the 5th degree of the scale, again we get C6, but with the 5th in the bass, G, A, C, E. And then from the note we've added to the scale, the A flat, B, D, F, that's just the diminished in its next inversion. From the 6th note of the scale, A, we get A, C, E, G. And again, that's just an inversion of C6, this time with the 6th in the bass. And yes, you would be right in thinking that is also A minor 7. I'll come back to that. Off the 7th note of the scale, you'd get B, D, F, A flat, another inversion of our diminished. And then taking us home back to C, E, G, A, C6. If I played that in chords, we'd have... So it's left us with C6, and then D diminished, and then the other diminished chords you get from that, right? So that is effectively 4 diminished chords packed in there. It's D, F, A flat, and B. So C6, D diminished, C6/E, F diminished, or inversion of D diminished, C6/G with the 5th in the bass, the A flat diminished, a C6 with the 6th in the bass, or B diminished, back to C6. Obviously there's different ways you can play this. That's just one way. You could voice that in many ways across the guitar. And I remember when I first encountered that, I was like, that's where these diminished chords come from that everyone puts in when they're playing chord melody, or you hear in like big band arrangements. And the other thing I just found mind-blowing is how, like, say, adding a note to a scale you think would mean that it opens up and means you get, maybe 8 chords from the scale as opposed to 7. But no, we just effectively get 2 chords and then just the inversions of those. Now, why is this so useful? Well, those inversions of C6, they offer us a C6 with the 3rd on the top, then the 5th on the top, then the 6th on the top, and then the root on the top. So that in itself is incredibly useful. The diminished gives us the 4th of the key on top. Going to give us that flat 6 thing, and then we've got the 7th as well, and then the 2nd. So obviously the remaining notes of the scale, the non-chord tones, are on top of each of our diminished chords. Now there's a few other observations you want to be aware of. I alluded to this earlier, which is that C, E, G, A is the same notes just in a different order as A, C, E, G, which is C6 and A minor 7. So all of these C6 shapes would also work for A minor 7. You just have to get your head around the fact that that's the 5th of an A minor on top, that's the 7th on top, that's the root on top, that's the 3rd on top. So they're the same, but you do, to be able to use them, you have to appreciate intervallically that the note on top, obviously for our kind of solo playing, chord playing, an E against a C is a 3rd, against an A minor it's a 5th. The other big observation is that diminished chords, one way they function is like dominants, leading us to other chords. Now, if you take that B diminished or D diminished, probably easier to look at B diminished, B, D, F, A, then let's compare it to G7. G, B, D, F. We can see a big overlap in notes there. Now if I play G7 flat 9, G, B, D, F, A flat, we can see that these diminished chords are essentially like a G7 flat 9 without the root. Meaning, whilst you can view this going between C6, then the diminished, the sound you're also getting is the all-important 1 and chord 5, albeit without the root on the 5 chords. So it essentially becomes chord 1, then G7 flat 9, chord 1, G7 flat 9, chord 1, G7 flat 9, chord 1, G7 flat 9, back home. which is why it works perfectly like home, tension leads you to the next chord, tension leads you to the next chord, and so on. And some of this information might be too much right now, because first off, what you need to do is get used to actually just physically playing these shapes, and trying to maybe start to then follow the basics of harmonizing chord tones with chords, and then non-chord tones with the diminished. So think of this as just an introduction, really. And you might also be wondering if this works for minor. It does. If I did C minor 6, same thing, and so forth. Maybe a topic for another day. Now, the PDFs of this lesson are available on Patreon on the lowest tier. That also gives you access to all of my chord melodies and other bonus uploads that I've made. Don't forget, jazz guitar lessons here every Monday. Until next time, you take care.